Hi, everybody. This is I Didn't See Anyone Who Looked Like Me, Gender and Racial Representation in Board Gaming, part of my PhD dissertation. So here's my contact information on Twitter, and here's my professional website where you can go through all kinds of projects that I'm working on right now, from holograms to AI chatbots, as well as my research on board games. So I started my career first as a tech reporter a long, long time ago, and then I went into working with publicly traded companies on something that you're probably familiar with, corporate dashboards. And think of it like a cockpit of an airplane where you can see what's going on. You have the windshield, you can see what's in front of you, the market context, and you can also see the health of that particular vehicle. And so corporations look for that kind of display of how they're doing, how they're addressing their audience, as well as how they're addressing the wider marketplace. So that was my area of specialization. And one of the things that I found in doing that work is particularly the people that I tended to do this work for, there were senior executives, C-suite, CEOs, CFOs, publicly traded companies for the most part, startups as well. They tended to be middle class, white, and male. And one of the things that I learned working with this particular group of leaders, business leaders, is they really privilege numbers more than stories. So working with businesses, it was much more impactful to have an empirical sweep of the numbers and statistics, much, much more persuasive to this audience than just an anecdote, which they might have addressed as an outlier story. And, one of the tropes that I heard a ton working with this particular audience of business leaders, political leaders, is numbers don't lie. They said that over and over. And so I really worked hard to make sure that I was providing the best possible audit of market situations and audience information as well. And, there's all kinds of social cultural reasons for this. I'm just a tip of the hat to Neil Postman, who, coined the term technopoly. And that's our culture, particularly in North America, really privileges numbers, machines, more than subjective human stories. And of course, this isn't the only way of knowing, but this is the privileged way that we view our culture. We tend to privilege statistics, numbers, and that sort of thing. So I designed a research study to look at the board gaming market. I've been an avid board gamer my whole life. Since I was a little kid, it's always been a part of my family. And I wanted to structure a PhD dissertation that looks specifically at gender and racial representation in board gaming. And to do this, I did a content analysis, or several content analyses, visual analyses, an online survey, and qualitative interviews with a wide variety of people, both in the hobby and in the board game industry. And I wanted to get the answer to 4 questions. The first question was, what was the demographic profile of designers of the most popular board games? And is there a lack of diversity within that sample space? And then the second question was, to what extent does board gaming cover artwork of these popular games evince limited or inequitable demographic representation? And then 3, and I'm just going to summarize this very quickly, does the lack of representation of, women, non-binary, BIPOC representation, Black, Indigenous, persons of color in artwork act as a barrier for board games' wider growth? Does it delimit its expansion, its adoption as a cultural practice? And then finally, how does this limited representation and diversity impact board game enthusiasts in spaces where gaming is practiced? And that includes online and offline. So to do this, I looked at Board Game Geek, and specifically I had done a study in 2018 that looked at the top 200 games. And in this PhD dissertation, I wanted to double the size of that database. So I looked at Board Game Geek because it's a really good place to kind of look at where the cultural practice lies right now. And especially with the 2 million users, I thought it was a great place to work from. So here's the big headline for the board game design question. So of the top 400 Board Game Geek ranked games, here's what the game designer demography looks like. So white men are listed 540 times in association with these top 400 games. White women are listed 16 times, BIPOC men 24 times, and white non-binary 3 times. Okay, so this nets out as 92.6% white men in terms of the labor of board game design in this sample space, which is that top 400 games. White women, 2.7%, BIPOC men, 4.1%, and white non-binary, 0.5%. So 92.6% is the way that has netted out in terms of the labor of board game designs within that sample space, which is those top 400 games once again. And I get asked a lot, has the needle moved since I did a smaller sample size back in 2018? And the answer is it hasn't, not much. So 11 white women were designers in the top 400 board games. There was one white non-binary person. Again, 540 white men and 6 BIPOC men represent the total number of designers. And this was the result from the 2018 study, 93.5%. So a smaller sample, 200 games. So we haven't moved much or at all. So for the answer for the first question, the first research question is the demography of board game design as it currently stands based on this audit of top 400 games. Is it diverse, or is the labor of board game design diverse? And the answer, of course, is no. And it skews very heavily with a very small slice of demography. And this was really based, a lot of the ideas of my study design come from other studies that have been done in the video game space, in the television and film and web series space, and there are many others. And so one example is the card study that's done for film, television, and web series. And what's interesting about that audit, it was done over the course of a 12-month period. It uncovered that of the speaking rules on television, film, and web series during that period, 71.7% of the speaking rules were white. And there's lots and lots of studies like this. I didn't find any studies about board gaming specifically, and that's why I wanted to create this work. It's kind of a foundational piece for board gaming. Here's an example of a study that was done by the Paris Institute of Political Studies, and they basically looked at the readings they were assigned in courses, and only 3.5% of their readings were BIPOC authors, and 15.45% were women. So this is a really, really common challenge across sectors. This is just I actually do a lot of work in Wikipedia, and 17% of all Wikipedia biographies are about women, which I find very, very interesting. So there's a real gap and dearth of content. And a recent study that was kind of making waves on academic Twitter, where women are representing 2/3 of the doctorates for archaeology, for example, but only get 1/3 of the tenure track positions. So this is what we might call in the business systemic, that there's a really, really strong skew toward whiteness and maleness in certain labor spaces and in certain sectors. And board gaming, of course, is a particularly strong example of that skew. Okay. So then I wanted to get the answer to the second question, which is, what is board game artwork? What is the state of board game artwork? And in this case, I looked at the top 200 Board Game Geek games because this is a very, very onerous exercise. I sat there sometimes with a magnifying glass and looked at each cover, and it was the topmost cover of each of the board games in the top 200. And what I uncovered was, in this case, it skewed very heavily male at 76.8%. So of all the characters I logged, and it was almost 2,000 characters, and 23.2% were feminine presenting or women or girls. And, I was not surprised by this, but I was surprised actually about the incredible gap. 82.5% of the board game characters that I was looking at presented as Caucasian white, okay? And 17.5% were presenting as BIPOC. So you've got that split, 528 white characters and 112 BIPOC presenting characters. And again, that breakdown, 647 masculine presenting characters and 195 feminine. Now, there were many instances where I couldn't discern gender, race at all. It was kind of shadowy figures. maybe in a crowd, and I log them as well, just saying gender and race indeterminate. Okay, so there's quite a number of those. And what I found discouraging is that you're more likely to see an image of something that doesn't exist in our reality, like a dragon, an orc, an imp, some kind of fantastic creature or an alien, is much more likely to appear on a board game cover than an image of a woman. Okay, so 231 instances of aliens or fantastic creatures versus 184 women. And what I found particularly discouraging about this work and sample, and I didn't even really have, I didn't have a pessimistic hypothesis, frankly, going into it, but this certainly made me feel very pessimistic. In that top 200 Board Game Geek ranked games, you're more likely to see an image of a bird than you would a BIPOC woman, okay? And even more discouraging, and I found this incredibly depressing and disheartening, you're more likely to see a horse than a BIPOC woman on cover art. So is there a lack of diversity? Is it skewed? Does it represent very limited demographic diversity? 100% yes. Okay, so I'm calling this particular section of my presentation a Hey Publishers, with apologies to Seth Meyers. This is the Hey section of the presentation. And I just wanted to take a moment to, as I was doing this work for corporate leaders, one of the things I was always very, very strict about is doing your homework when it comes to your audience. And I'm just going to give a couple of examples here. I go through a lot more detail in my dissertation, obviously, but you're looking at consumer marketplaces where, the Chicago population is 50% BIPOC and 49.9% white. You've got New York City, 57.27% BIPOC and 42.73% white. So you've got these huge consumer markets. Thinking from a neoliberal, consumeristic perspective, if you're a large publisher and these are your big urban hubs, does that split of a little over 17% representation on your board game work make sense? And, similarly here in Toronto, where I am right now, again, that 50-50 split in the GTA, so the Greater Toronto Area, the largest city in Canada, the fourth largest city in North America, and a consumer hotbed for board games, if I can say. Definitely is. And, there's some really interesting analysis happening right now. Again, going back to film and television analysis, this was a very arresting figure out of Hollywood. If you produce a $159 million film, and you do not have authentically inclusive representation, so representation that is positive, that is three-dimensional, that is not a stereotype, that is not negative, you will make more money, is the big upshot with that study. But if you produce a film that does not have that, and it's about $159 million in budget, on that opening weekend pre-pandemic, that film was going to lose, or was poised to lose, $32.2 million. And could lose as much as 80% of its budget over its runtime because it lacked authentically inclusive representation. So Hollywood is making these decisions, leaving money on the table. And again, as I go through this presentation, I'm going to be making the point that board game publishers are leaving both money on the table and leaving people behind as they lack that authentically inclusive representation. So really interesting numbers out of Higginbotham, Phil Zeng, and Ulis, the 2020 study of Hollywood. So you have to ask yourself why. Why are publishers, why are big film producers making these decisions? You have to ask why, because it's not about financials. So this takes me now to the part where I ask, does this matter to board gamers? And what I did was an online survey that actually included 320 participants. I actually had to cut it off. I was getting more and more results, and I actually had to end it at the end of October just to make my research deadline. But there was a real appetite for communicating perspectives about board games, and I was really gratified to see the level of engagement from the participants. This was promoted on BGG, Twitter, and Reddit. And what I found, and I actually did do a call asking to hear from women, LGBTQ, BIPOC board gamers. So I did do a call, but nobody was excluded from doing this study. And what I got back was of the people who participated in the study, 54.4% were women or identified as women, 19.9% identified as men, 12.2% identified as trans, and 13.6% identified as non-binary.
Really, why would any this and stuff?
Is that a question?
But moving out of the space of, from student to lecturer, I think.
Oh, someone got cut off. I'm going to continue. Okay. All I can see is my slides, so unfortunately, I'm just going to have to wait and answer the questions afterwards. So I also asked, do you identify as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, BIPOC? And 20.4% identified as BIPOC. And 78.3% identified as not BIPOC. So best at describing your sexual orientation, I think the really great headline here is that more people who identified as LGBTQ filled out the survey. So they were the majority of the individuals filling out this survey, with heterosexual at 47.2%. And then what's another really, I can't go into all of the demography. There's so much richness there because we will not have time today. It's an incredibly rich kind of census of the board gaming community. But what's terrific about this is board gamers, at least the people who filled out this survey, represented from BGG and mainly Reddit, are very educated. And it was actually a hypothesis that I had when I started the research, because I did seem to find a lot of academics who are very, very into board games. And so what was really fascinating to me is it's over the population average. And a couple of interesting findings is the average U.S. citizen, I think it's 13.9% have a postgraduate degree, so a master's or higher. In this sample, it's 28%, so quite a bit higher than the population average. And another thing I'll point you to is PhDs represented 6.9% of the sample, and the population average for PhDs, I just found this really interesting, is 4.5% for the US, and there's a little fewer of us in Canada, hopefully soon to be me, at 0.88%. So board game enthusiasts tend to have a fair amount of education. And in this case, just a quick summary of the people who filled out the survey, 73.8% were from North America, although it did go global, and I was really happy about that. 67.8% reported being in their 30s or 40s. 80.2% identified as a woman, non-binary, trans. 74.9% identified as white. Again, the majority were LGBTQ. And again, just going over the 20.4 were BIPOC, 78.9% reported being in another relationship with another person or persons, and 81.8% had completed some form of post-secondary education, just as I noted, and 58.5% reported household incomes higher than $50,000 a year. So the other really interesting thing about this study is these participants, the survey participants, are diehard board gamers. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting is the length of time in the hobby. And what we see is people with more than 11 years of experience or working within board gaming or participating as a hobbyist at 53.5%. And what's also very, very fascinating to me is, and I'll just skip ahead to the conclusion, that 70.7% of the participants of the survey game at least weekly. So that's a pretty committed audience and very, very passionate about this hobby. So does a lack of representation and diversity in board game artwork matter? Does a lack of diversity and representation in board game design matter to these diehard board gamers? As you can see, that they're quite avid. And what I did is a Likert scale of, basically it's a psychometric scale. You've seen them all the time. It's the strongly agree to strongly disagree continuum. And what I got back was a level of passion. I've been doing marketing studies most of my career. It's rare to see this level of strongly agree. You tend to get people that are much more in the middle. And what I got was an incredible amount of passion for this particular statement. There was many of them. There was about 123 type of statements and questions that I was asking the participants. So it was quite an extensive study. And what I got back, and this was really passionate, 61.9% strongly agreed with the statement, the board gaming industry is dominated by white men. Agree was 27.7%. So a lot of passion there. So the net of it was 89.2% agreed or strongly agreed with that statement, that the space, the industry, was really heavily dominated by white men. And this is a quote that I really love. Elizabeth Hargrave posted it to Twitter a while back. And she basically used an analogy. It's, like a Zumba class. And most of the Zumba classes, in the before times pre-pandemic, were usually female at almost 100%. And she noted that men come occasionally, but I've never seen a man return. So being a woman or a BIPOC individual in the board game design space is like a man who stubbornly decides to come back to Zumba. So it can be quite lonely. And what I also got from the study, maybe because of the frustration of the Likert scale, a lot of people reported amazing stories to me in the comment section rather of the study. They wrote in many quite voluminous comments at the end of the survey, sharing their stories or writing in comments to specific questions. And this was one of the specific comments to that question that I got back. And this individual says, once asked UK's largest gaming convention to be more representative, guests and panels, and got laughed at. Okay, so I did see from the study a very strong amount of passion around this statement that board gaming has a problem with a lack of equitable racial representation in board game artwork at 84%. So very high. And similarly, 83.6% agreed or strongly agreed that board gaming has a problem with a lack of equitable representation around gender in board game artwork. And, one of the big sort of alarm bell things that I saw too is, again, this strong passion. And I wanted to call this out specifically. Positive racial and gender and racial representation in a game enhances my enjoyment while playing that game. And again, that really overwhelming passion at strongly agree, 60.4%. The game is felt to be more fun, more enjoyable, if it has positive gender and racial representation. And for me, seeing these kinds of numbers and seeing this level of passion in a Likert scale, it's the odd time you see that kind of majority strongly agree. You can tell that there's a real appetite in the marketplace. So again, it takes us to our little corner. Hey, publishers. And here's a moment where my study was actually picked up by the Daily Caller back in 2018, just before Christmas. Do not recommend. Wasn't the most fun that I've ever had. But here's a headline from the Daily Caller talking about my study, and they get it right. Board games don't do enough to reflect the diversity of America's population. So I wanted to call that out. This is probably the rare time that the Daily Caller nails a perspective. Great headline. Not great comments, not a great story. Okay, so the final research question is, how does limited representation and diversity impact board game enthusiasts in spaces where gaming is practiced? And this is gaming events, conventions, online fora, and digital platforms. And here's where I got some really distressing findings. Okay, 4 in 10 of the survey respondents agreed or strongly agreed that they were treated differently due to their gender identity. And so what we've got here is, a really interesting finding. And there was questions about, are you discriminated against? Have you experienced bad behavior? And what I got back again is that 4 in 10 said, yes, they were treated differently due to their gender identity. So this is in board gaming spaces. 1 in 3 agreed or strongly agreed that they have experienced homophobic remarks while engaging in the board game hobby. Okay. And a few noted that, it wasn't necessarily directed at them, but they witnessed it frequently, and it really bothered them. 1 in 3 reported experiencing unwelcome sexual advances while participating in the board gaming hobby. And this is something that I've seen for a long while, discussed on certainly Twitter, where a lot of people have come forward very bravely to share stories. And I wanted to specifically hone in on this question to find out, again, to lend that weight of empiricism, that statistical research, hopefully to prevail upon industry leaders that this is a really significant issue in the board gaming sector, as well as, of course, other sectors and in our lives. And then 1 in 3 agreed or strongly agreed that when they engage with board game topics online, they have received online threats, insults, and or rude messages. And I heard from very, very many people. I got about 175 written comments, many sharing that they completely opt out of engaging in any kind of board gaming discourse online because they're afraid of their reaction to their questions, their concerns. So they just opt out entirely. And that's a huge problem, by the way. Again, just making that sort of capitalistic appeal. When you cannot find your audience, when your audience is afraid to demonstrate their preferences, that's an audience that might and does migrate away from that particular hobby because of that kind of negative feedback that they get. And then 7 in 10 have experienced incivility in the hobby, being interrupted, talked over, or treated rudely. And I did get a lot of comments about, their very, very specific experiences in the hobby and how, some of them have decided that they cannot chance going into public spaces and board gaming spaces anymore. So this is another example of an anonymous comment in that board gamer study that I conducted. And this really talks about, besides open groups that see no issue with it being all guys, there's a lot of friendly sexism that happens. For example, surprised unsolicited comments from strangers at adjacent tables about women in wargaming, some con attendees who steamroll me at events that I'm hosting. And this person talks about the fact that it's a hobby permeated by obnoxiousness. So that's very difficult. That's a very distressing finding. And I certainly, if I were an industry leader, I'd be distressed by that significantly. 1 in 3 reported avoiding public board gaming events before the pandemic. So that's another really interesting finding. And there's so much depth in this research. I'm just giving you a taste of it right now. This is going through peer review. But there are some really, really interesting findings that I will be sharing hopefully shortly, probably in a journal, about how it impacts purchase and play behavior. And I think this particular piece, I'm avoiding, the individual sharing that they avoid public board gaming events for reasons that we've walked through. And, the other really fascinating thing is, the stories. So this is another example of an anonymous commenter who talked about playing at friendly local game stores, sharing their experience with Friday Night Magic, where a man fumed and threw a temper tantrum because I beat him 1 round. His friend made excuses for him, saying that he can't stand losing to girls. I tend to find that when I walk into a game store or gaming environment and see no other women, it's better for me to walk right back out than bother trying to break through any prejudices. So that was, this was a significant one because I heard this a lot or read this a lot in the comments, that people like it, but they have to quietly like board games and stay out of public spaces, stay out of game stores, stay away from conventions because it's not necessarily a safe or welcoming space for them. So again, this takes us to our quick little corner. This is Hey Industry. And I think that the key point here is that really the industry needs to carefully look at this. And like the cockpit that I created for publicly traded companies, this is a really, really important issue for everyone to kind of tackle, take on board. And I'm looking at a lot of the changes in the industry and a lot of the moves that the industry is making, albeit kind of stutter step. They're making it for sound business reasons. Their addressable market is in this case, in this particular survey, kind of yelling at them and asking. And there's a lot of questions that I ask in the study about I wish board game publishers would. And there were a lot of prompts that they wish board game publishers would publish more diverse games. They wish board game publishers would publish more games designed by BIPOC designers, by women designers, by LGBTQ designers, by non-binary designers. There's a real pent-up appetite. Now, I wasn't sure, at this point, I kind of put this prompt in here. If there are any questions from the audience, I'd love to hear them or field them. I think we had a few people who got cut off or just wanted to ask if there are any questions at all. Yes, yeah. So I initially posted the survey specifically on Reddit board games, and then moved it to sample space because it's tricky to post things to board games. You move to sample space. I promoted it on Twitter, and I promoted it across BGG forums. So as many as I could find. What was terrific was a lot of people actually went and posted it to Facebook, their own gaming groups. So it did go a bit viral. And what was really cool to me is how global it did go. There was actually a fair amount of participation from all around the world, and a level of diversity, at least from that census portion, that I haven't seen in maybe more hobbyist or industry market research posts, typically done through online polls. So I did shop it around as much as I reasonably could on Twitter and Board Game Geek. But I really wanted people who were dedicated, avid board gamers. That's great. And one of the things that I have to say, I actually purposely kind of stopped it here. It is a very, very difficult area to research. And just a personal note, I was surprised. I spend a lot of time, or did, pre-pandemic, in friendly local game stores. My partner and I, our house is basically more made of board games. And I had been researching something else with my PhD dissertation. And I realized that board games, I was actually looking at, AI and VR fusion, and I was actually creating solutions to help with training, and I was trying to teach empathy, specifically around workplace harassment and bullying, because it's an area that's really near and dear to my heart. And particularly around contested spaces and very, white male dominated spaces, because I've worked in them my entire career. And what I was really surprised by when I started this work is how difficult it is to be a game scholar, particularly a game scholar who identifies as a woman. And one of the things I will say, just from my own anecdotal experience, is engaging with board game topics online, and Andy, your question's a really good one, can be very, very difficult. It can be quite scary. Here's my little image of a troll. And one of the things, when I did my 2018 study, and a few people, maybe saw me on Twitter talking about this, you get a lot of hate. So I got, my study in 2018 was picked up by the Daily Caller and a few other, I shall not name, YouTube sites. And it was really, really difficult. And what that told, it actually, a lot of my fellow game scholars, warned me about this. But I was really surprised about the level of vitriol that can be lobbed at, somebody who's trying really a difficult process to bleed subjectivity out of it and create a very empirical study. And I actually got criticized initially with my 2018 study that I pulled a lot of punches, and it was just the numbers, just stuck to the numbers, which is what I did in my old career. And it is very difficult and very can be a little bit dangerous to talk about these topics online. I'm just going to give an example. of a kind of comment that I got. And what is really, really interesting, some of them are quite a bit more threatening than this. This is as much as I will swear this early in the morning, or share swear words this early in the morning. But this is an example of the type of comment that the 2018 study got. Hey, dumbass researcher, just tell the underrepresented groups to design their own games. If they don't choose to, then you should, it's a typo, you should stop wasting time and your taxpayer money doing stupid and pointless studies. It's probably worth noting that this is a completely unfunded study, and I'm doing it for my own interest and edification and really to contribute to game scholarship, because video games are very actively researched. Board games less so, which I always found very strange. So it is a really, really dangerous space to comment on the industry. And certainly we see that all the time with content creators and commentators and reviewers taking a lot of heat, a lot of flack, talking about these issues. But they are the most fundamentally important issues that we could possibly tackle. Board gaming is a microcosm of a larger macrocosm of the world. And board gaming is very similar to, contested spaces in tech, where I worked for years and years. So it can be a very, very difficult thing to analyze. And one of the things that I really liked, actually Suzanne Sheldon talked about it the other day, that feedback is a gift. That someone taking the time, as a lot of researchers are doing right now with board gaming, and commentators are doing with board gaming, it's an act of love and a contribution to the sector. That people are sticking their necks out to share, hey, maybe you're going the wrong way from a larger scale industry perspective, that your large publishers are missing the boat, and people taking the time and sticking their necks out, even though they do get attacked, is a gift, and please do take it as such. And I think that the other thing, and I adore this, I don't want to end on such a downer note, but things like Raina and Phil's 1 Minute Board Game and their TikTok, where they use my research to talk about inclusion in board gaming. I think I burst into tears, actually. It was an amazing, amazing thing to see that dialogue happening. And there are the occasional really good thing that happens in the sector. This was one thing that, again, I think I definitely teared up, where Clarence Simpson really pushed his publisher to ensure BIPOC women representation. A BIPOC woman, a beautiful, strong BIPOC woman on a board game cover, simply because he realized that there was a problem in the industry. And one of the things I keep thinking about as I do this research, I attended a talk recently about broadcast, television broadcast. And there was a commentator talking about our public broadcaster here in Canada, the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And one of the things that she was talking about was this notion of an imagined audience. And what was really, really interesting, she said, everyone imagines in their head Susie from Saskatchewan. In fact, she said she was constantly admonished to imagine, a kind of almost middle American prairie, in this case in Canada, farmer, and the imagined Susie in Saskatchewan is, in this person's recounting, a white woman, a white middle-aged woman, and they were constantly creating a broadcast package for an imagined audience. And I think that, and it was basically like she didn't say this, but it's almost like a zombie idea, an idea of an audience that no longer exists or doesn't exist in the scope and scale that you think it does. And I keep wondering if publishers they've got a bit of a fictitious understanding of their own audience. And, one of the things that I think is really wonderful about the feedback I got in the online survey specifically is that census, which demonstrates, the 320 diehard board gamers that filled out that survey, slogged through 123 questions, are the kinds of people that can make or break a Kickstarter campaign, are the people that will keep your local board game store, your friendly local game store, afloat, will keep your online board game sales company afloat. And they are committed. They're quietly, in some cases, committed to board gaming. And I really fundamentally believe that publishers have a misunderstanding of their imagined audience as a result of this research, right? That was a bit long-winded. Let me know if you have another question. Anything else? Ooh, yeah. So I think that the one thing I really touch a lot on in my dissertation is that I believe, and this was based on my previous research, that gaming, board gaming, and video gaming gives you the skills you need for the 21st century. But and there's a lot of research that backs this up. If you're excluded from games and gaming spaces, which many of us are, I certainly was growing up, where I would ask to join, various gaming spaces, and I was told, no, girls don't play games. Then you're going to lack some of the semiotic understanding, some of the design grammar around gaming, and you're going to have to build that up. And it's a skill, it's an understanding. And I think that the biggest thing that I am really troubled by is because it's very difficult to access games and gaming spaces for certain identities. It can some of the stories that I learned in the survey were that people, despite it all, despite having horrifically terrible experiences, kept coming back. And I think that it's incumbent upon publishers, large voices in the industry, to create spaces to build that pipeline of BIPOC, LGBTQ women who get access to that design grammar, the semiotics of games, get versed, and create gamers, first of all, who then design games. Because it's kind of a vicious circle. You are excluded from gaming spaces, therefore you can't get the systems literacy to make games. And so I would love to see, one anecdote that I always think about is I used to do public relations for Microsoft. This was in the early days when I was a reporter, and then I moved to working for large companies, helping them with their market expansion. And Microsoft didn't care about sales so much as they cared about growing the number of people, this was in the 90s, that actually use computers. So they were really focused on, they didn't really care too much about, they cared about revenue, but they wanted to say, I want grandpa. I want, the 14-year-old boy. I want the middle-aged woman. And they wanted to expand out the number of people that had access to their tools to create a bigger and bigger community of people who used computers. And I think that board gaming and gaming need to do the same thing, where they need to focus their efforts on growing a marketplace, which doesn't always necessarily mean money initially. It means you're growing a community that is conversant, has access, can learn. And sometimes that involves giving things away for free so that you have a growing community that's included and that they can see themselves in the games, and they can understand that they could tell their own stories in these games. So it's a much more complex issue in terms of growing a pipeline of new designers. And what I really am so encouraged by is, these different programs that are mentorship programs, that are industry mentorship programs, to bring people along, to pull them up into board game sector spaces. So that would be the kind of expansion strategy that I would suggest for a publisher, that you want to start creating a community, an inclusive community. And there are all sorts of ways to start doing that, because it's a bigger problem than just representation. I had to really focus my research effort down to just representation, but there's more. Representation isn't just a lever you pull and you say, look, we've got representation now we're good. No, because you have to bring people into the industry. And the other really interesting thing, I'm actually going to try and see if I can find that slide. Elizabeth, to your really, really good question. And this is where I'd really like to expand this particular aspect out. So does a more diverse design team make a better product? And here's a little tiny splice. And this is actually credit to you, Elizabeth Hargrave. The rule book, so I did a big study on rule books with my colleague, Dr. Shelley Jones, and we found that white women designers had created Better rule books. So the rubric was at a 4. White women got 3.5%, 3.5 out of 4 on their rule book being more inclusive. BIPOC men got so quite close, 3.25. And white men who designed the game, and I know they're not always responsible entirely for the rule book, but 2.8% or 2.8 out of 4. So do diverse teams make a better, more inclusive product? This seems to indicate it does. And I'd like to take this further and expand this out because I believe in diverse teams. I believe you create a better product with diverse teams. So that's a really so onboarding people into the industry is the way to go. And I hope that answered the question. Any other questions? I have so many slides, by the way. There's so many slides. I just didn't want to go over. Oh, and by the way, big headline, when we did this study, we didn't have this this qualitative perspective for our study on rule books, but people say that they less regretted purchasing a rule book when it uses he only when referring to a player, but they were bothered by it quite a bit more. So they didn't have as much regret. You know, we bought it, okay, we'll play it, it's fine. But they really were bothered when he only is used referring to the player. So there's a lot of different dimensions for this study, and there's so much data. I'm going to have to parse it out in all kinds of different ways. Any other questions?
Okay, yes. Our next question comes from Prof. Cell. I'm not sure the full name here, but Prof. Cell in the chat. Are you aware of any groups or initiatives attempting to affiliate designers and activists across board games, TTRPGs, and video games? And wants to know if the issues are largely the same. I'm sorry, it's Mike Cell is the name.
Okay, so board gamers and activists. Well, you know what's interesting? I can't speak to there's a lot of examples, and you know every single day I find on Twitter these kinds of groups are forming. Just an example of from this week, at least in my life, I got to present with the Jack Layton Chair at Ryerson University, which is affiliated with the Faculty of Arts and the Faculty of Community Services at Ryerson. And it's about social activism. The Jack Layton Chair is basically about social justice and social activism. And we ran a workshop, Grow a Game, which is a methodology created by Dr. Mary Flanagan. And it's about remixing existing game mechanisms and games and remixing them against different values like compassion and empathy and themes like social justice and food inequality, food scarcity, migration crisis. And we did a workshop, and it was incredible to see students who are extremely active in social justice movements remixing existing mechanisms and thinking about creating board games with different themes. And I think these kinds of grassroots programs will make all the difference because, you know, one of the reasons I think my study got picked up by the New York Times, it was in response to the cancellation of the GMT Scramble for Africa. The writer basically linked my study with this idea that there was a lot of recursion, a lot of derivative game themes, and the stories being told in games were, you know, quite again recursive. That they, you know, and it's a lot of it is I think publishers being afraid to branch out. And you know, if a previous game sold fairly well on a theme of colonialism, they might dust it off and try it again, which happens a lot in video games and films, etc. It's very derivative, and the writer linked the lack of diversity in board game design to that challenge, right? That we weren't telling different stories, that we weren't remaking games in a way that was more reflective of our evolving culture. That, you know, the world maybe didn't need another game about colonialism. And I think that there's some real merit in that argument, that we need to hear from different voices. And, you know, I just wanted to, you know, really acknowledge Eric Lang and his work in this space and bringing people along and mentoring them. Voices like Suzanne Sheldon and Mandy Hutchinson, who were an inspiration to me when I was entering this space and actually joined Twitter just to learn more about board games and got so much value from their content. Bebo, listening to all of these, Danny Plays Games, all of these amazing content creators who are creating incredible content and really pushing for different stories, different ideas. Room 51, Matthew McCack, doing some really, really fascinating analysis of board games and asking questions and pushing for greater diversity, more stories, different ideas. And I think that that's going to make the board gaming industry and hobby a much richer, more inclusive place, a more compelling place, frankly, for my money. Any other questions?
No more questions at the moment.
And I think the really big thing is, again, that imagined audience. I think I really worry sometimes when I look at certain decisions that I see being made, across sectors, where I think people have not really done their homework when it comes to demography, when it comes to looking at, consumer spaces and communities, and not really done enough investigation. And that might be a function of board gaming's initially mom and pop status, where they're typically small teams. Maybe they don't have the resources to do robust audience research. But if they don't fix that, the world will leave them behind. I think that's the story I always used to tell senior leaders in publicly traded companies. You don't do your homework, and you will not make it.
What do you think the best way to break out of your own small inset group, like just playing with your friends, only tests with certain people, but how do you break out of that? How do you get a larger group of people?
That's a really, really good question. I think that one of the things, again, the stories from the commenters in my research were really, really fascinating. And one of the things, there were some real, and I actually have deliberately avoided talking about the qualitative interviews in this research because I still have a step I need to do with the individuals that I interview to make sure that they're happy. I gave them assumed names, and as it goes through peer review, I don't want to bug them every time I make a cut to the content. But a lot of the qualitative interviews had some really, really amazing action steps that could be taken. And one of the big takeaways that I had, just at a very high level without referring to any specific interview, is the idea that you're curating communities and you're making sure, because of the reserve that a lot of the commenters and the interviews shared with me, a lot of them had to do their homework up front, really research a particular store, get word of mouth, understand, is this a safe space? Understand various communities. And they had to do a lot of homework up front to really curate who they were going to be playing with, because it's it's a really intimate thing. And, I've seen this play out in board game stores where there's a clique, a very closed group of people. The act of, me sitting down at Magic the Gathering, Friday Night Magic, is almost transgressive. Like, people will stare. And it's really, really hard once you've built a sort of hard-baked, exclusionary community to break into that. And it takes an enormous amount of courage on the part of the person who, almost is committing that transgressive act by walking in, plunking their cards down or asking to play a game or asking to play a role-playing game. It's really tricky to do. It takes, I think, and this is something that's, I think, everyone felt universally, it takes louder voices, people with bigger platforms, and industry leaders to say, hey, we're going to take this step. We're going to start curating communities, making inclusive spaces, conveying that it's going to be a safe space for everyone to join in, that we are going to take things seriously. If there is, problems within the game space or the gaming space, we're going to deal with them right away. And it's going to take a lot of time. And as an individual, I think you want to get out of your comfort zone. And if you don't have a diverse play standing gaming community, work to fix that. I think we all need to do that in our lives. We get kind of set in our ways, want to stay comfortable. We don't want to be confronted with requests to change. I think because we're extremely spoiled and entitled, and I think we've gotten more frightened than ever with a pandemic. But you have to really push yourself and the industry that you are participating in to make these changes, curate the spaces better, create opportunities for more diverse people to mix together in a play space. But it takes a village. It takes an entire sector. And I think individually we could push ourselves a lot more to be more welcoming and bring people in. And, again, it's hard for me not to talk about some of these amazing ideas that the qualitative interviews shared, but there's some really nice action steps in there. And again, a lot of them said, representation alone is not a lever you can pull and say, look, we're good, we're done. Yeah, look, we have a diverse cover. That's not enough. It has to be full integration within the industry, hiring people who are BIPOC, LGBTQ women, bringing them on board, making them a part of the sector, and I think that's the way through. Any other questions?
No real questions. Some people are definitely saying it was a real eye-opener and appreciating it.
It's great. Thank you so much.
We're under 5 minutes.
Okay, that's great. I have so many more things to say. I actually avidly cut, but now I realize I'm a little short on time. Yeah, and I think the other thing is I went deeper with some of the other studies that I conducted, which I highly recommend if you haven't seen our work, Shelley Jones and I's work, Dr. Jones. You can see that we've looked at this from a bunch of different dimensions. So I've delved into the rule books. I've looked at playable characters. And I heard a lot of really wonderful things from, parents who were like, thank you for looking into this, because it's always very disappointing to my daughter that she can't play, that she can't play a character that conforms to her gender identity. I think also moving just past the binary in gender presentation in gaming is an imperative. And if you haven't seen it, Matthew McCack did an absolutely wonderful, not a review of Everdale, which I strongly recommend everyone take a look at, because it's a beautiful, thoughtful analysis of a great game that has some significant problems in it. And again, that's the idea that, I focus really on a neoliberal kind of capitalistic review of board games, because that's my background. But it's also about how people feel. Do they feel like they're a part of something? Do they feel like they're a part of the community? Can they see themselves reflected in anything? And it's particularly hurtful when you can't see yourself reflected in a hobby that you love. And, again, it's hard not to talk about the qualitative interviews, but there was a really beautiful turn of phrase that somebody used in an interview with me. And it's this idea that we look for ourselves. We look for ourselves everywhere. As human beings, we look up into the clouds and we want to see faces and, in puddles. And we need, it feels good to feel like you're part of a community. And that's what we're hearing. And I think it's really incumbent on researchers like myself to use my skill set to say, you're missing something, publishers. You're missing something, people with large platforms in this board gaming sector. And you need to help bring this industry along and grow it. Because if you don't, then it won't be as vital as it could be. It will not expand. And I think everyone should have access to games and gaming experiences, because these are 21st century literacies that we desperately need. You need people with good, strong ability to look at a system and say, okay, this is a knock-on effect. If I do this, then this will happen. It's a critical literacy for, a world that will likely be in the grips of automation. And you're going to have learners that need these kinds of complex skill sets to be analytical. And access to games and board games specifically really helps you build those competencies. So it becomes a social problem when people don't have access to games and gaming spaces. Access to games and gaming spaces. Access to games and timing spaces. There's so much data. I will. This one, just a last point, references to he in the board game rule books that we looked at were 73.8%. References to she, 26.2%. So again, it shows a real skew, a really gendered skew toward men and males. Great. Guess we're almost at time.
All right. Where can people find a copy of these slides if they need to? And where can we find you?
You know what? I'm going to actually, right back here. There you go. If you wish to engage me on Twitter, I'm at Pobuda Tanya. And this is my website. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to post some of these slides up on my professional website. You can take a look at them. I will be publishing hopefully shortly. And my dissertation is winding its way through peer review right now. So hopefully stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for your kind attention and great questions.